Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shaun Casey, and I'm the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown University. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I think we're going to have a spectacular conversation today. We have a remarkable author and an equally remarkable book to talk about. Before I introduce Jessica, let me do a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, I'd like to thank our co-sponsor here at Georgetown, the Institute for the Study of International Migration. They have been our great partner for several years now. We welcome them and thank you for all of their collaboration here. Let me remind you, the webinar is being recorded and we will post this video on our event page in a day or two. And if you pre-registered for the event, you'll get an email with the link to the video as well. By this time, I think we're all Zoom veterans, but just in case your memories are not quite what they should be, I want to remind you we have a Q&A function on Zoom, and you'll notice on the tabs at the bottom of your screen, there is Q&A. We hope to reserve a good bit of time at the end so that you can direct your questions to Jessica, and I will be curating that. But please begin submitting your questions as soon as they pop into your head. Don't wait till the end. In that way, they'll give me a chance to sort through them and put the best ones to Jessica. I'm so pleased that Jessica Goudeau can join us. She has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post, LA Times, Teen Vogue, among many other places. She has a PhD in literature from the University of Texas, and she served as a Mellon Writing Fellow and Interim Writing Center Director at Southwestern University. She spent more than a decade working with refugees in Austin, Texas, and is the co-founder of the Hill Tribers, a nonprofit that provides supplemental income for Burmese refugee artisans for the past 7 years. And at the end, Jessica, if I forget, remind me, we'll also give your website address so if people want to contribute to some of that ongoing work, they'll know how to reach you. So Jessica, welcome. It's certainly great to have you.
I am so excited to be here. And I will say too, Hill Tribers actually ended when the last artisan got a job. So we successfully started and finished our nonprofit so that they could all have employment. So FYI, I appreciate the shout out though. I have lots of ideas of other places if we want to talk about it.
Well, fantastic. Yeah, let's make sure we circle back to that, particularly at the end. This is a remarkable book, and many of your reviews have noted that in some ways there are really three stories here. You tell the stories of two women in their brave and remarkable journeys, but also resettlement into the United States. And you also managed to give us a history of U.S. refugee policy, which is very, very complex and yet is a very important thread. So I guess my first question is, what drew you to these women and their stories into this amazing, messy intersection of policy around global refugee resettlement?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. And I think, you in particular understand as someone who works at the center of these things that are often, tagged or categorized in very separate ways, but really come together in very, in a beautiful, it is both messy and also gorgeous to see the intersection of these things. And so I'm particularly grateful to the Center for Peace, Religion, and World Affairs. Did I say it right? Did I get it in the right order?
Yeah.
For having me today, in part because one of the things I'm most excited about is to have a conversation that sits at the intersection of so many different things. And so I just to make it very brief, while I was getting my nonprofit, I worked with Burmese refugee artisans here living in Austin. And so I had what really felt like two career tracks. They certainly felt like two career tracks to many of my professors at UT who were very concerned about my focus on things outside of what is often a very limited and narrow field. And yet when I was writing the whole time, I kept thinking I'm focusing on issues of representation here in poetry in the middle of the 20th century between how the US and Brazil were portraying each other and having very similar conversations when we think about how we are portraying refugees and what it means, what the rhetoric around refugees looks like. And I had no idea how these things would come together until I was running a writing center at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas, very different from Georgetown University. I often have people get really confused. Sometimes I even say it incorrectly. But when I was running the writing center and realized the rhetoric around refugees was changing, it felt like it changed within a day. We went from 35 years of bipartisan support and, decades before that. And all of a sudden the word refugee became synonymous with terrorist. And so I felt like I, as someone who was uniquely situated, having had relationships with these two women and understanding the history of rhetoric and how conversations take place in the American public's mind, that I was maybe the only person that could kind of do this unique work. And so for me, this intersectionality of this book comes in part because of my relationships, but also my very odd academic background and the way that I kind of paired these things that come together. But they make so much sense. This is my favorite thing about interdisciplinarity, right? Is like you can take this and put it together in these ways, right?
Yeah, and I think that really comes through in the book that particularly, and we'll talk about this later, we have a moment, the way you organize the book. I mean, this could be a radical train wreck, right? But
It was in some drafts. That, let's be honest, there were several drafts that were fairly radical train wrecks.
Right, but your end product, I mean, the train wreck was avoided in the sense that, and so let's begin. You begin the book by beginning to tell the story of Mu Na, who comes from Myanmar and has this very circuitous journey, which I think starts when she's 5 years old.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what precipitated her movement, and then tell us a little bit about what it was like to get off that plane in Austin, Texas for her.
Yeah, well, there are kind of two things when you talk about it, and I think, I really want to be cognizant of the fact that we may be talking to people who themselves are interested in writing at some point, and so I want to talk both about the subject and a little bit about the craft, because I think
Mhm.
that was something that I was kind of learning as I went. The trope that we often have, the stereotype we have of refugees, is that the journey that is told in every Western movie is refugees are in war. It's really terrible. There's a journey either across an ocean or through a desert, sometimes in the jungle, depending on if it's a Rambo film. And then they are saved by Westerners, and then that's the end. The like boat is picked up, the soldier is there, everything is wonderful.
Right.
And I wanted to begin there and show the opposite of that. I wanted that to be the beginning of the story, kind of outside of the frame. And so I began with Muna's first journey because that was the expected story I think a lot of people had.
Right.
And because I wanted to talk about how young she was and what that was like, and give some of the background behind the longest running civil war in the world, which divided her family, because she's a Karen, she's of the Karen ethnicity, which is a discrete group there are several other groups that are being persecuted by the junta there. But I also wanted to show in the very beginning, it wasn't war that was the most stressful for her, it was her parents' divorce. And I think we often come to these stories expecting refugees to really only be able to talk about the trauma that they've endured, when throughout these interviews I've just done dozens and dozens of interviews at this point with refugees, very, very rarely is it, though the bombs are stressful, though the war itself is stressful, it's the neighborhood, it's the family dynamics, just like it is for any of us. When we think about the pandemic, it's not just the pandemic that is stressful, but what it means for us at home and how this affects our lives, and just the minutia of who we are as people, right? And so
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to show, both through her crossing the first border and her arriving in Austin.
Yeah. So you do then, particularly then, as you tell the story very dramatically about getting off the plane in the first few days in Austin. I mean, all I can think back to is when I was living in West Texas and visiting friends in Austin, where the early signs that said "Keep Austin Weird," and I'm thinking, what must this be like? But tell us a little bit about the role of the Texas resettlement agency in the various equities. There's some religious groups there. Tell us a little bit about that really messy but beautiful, as you say, process of someone trying to integrate, or at least become familiar with, this crazy American culture.
Yeah, and so just to tell you a little bit about my relationship with Muna, she was actually my very first former refugee friend. And so I got to be a part of this story. Refugee Services of Texas is the name of the organization. At the time, it was a very small, I think it was only in Austin. They have since grown in the 15 years or so since the story takes place, a little bit less, to one of the largest resettlement agencies in the country. And they currently settle about 3% of refugees that are resettled in the United States total. And so part of what is kind of complicated and interesting for me was telling the story of it was a pretty scrappy agency too. And so you don't see this because it's focused on Muna, but there was a caseworker in her case. I don't even actually know who it is. I tried to find her, who was really overwhelmed at the time. There was a huge influx kind of out of the blue of a bunch of refugees who came over from Myanmar. And this was during the George W. Bush years. And they kind of elevated, they raised the ceiling and everybody came, and boys, refugee resettlement agencies were scrambling. And I wanted to show that a little bit, in part because I want us to keep an eye on what might come if there is a raise at some point, right? Like this is not a tap that we can turn off and on. So Muna arrived in Austin and had just, when she described it for me, so she and I've known each other for a long time. She now speaks English well enough to be one of the best translators within our community here in Austin. And so she was able to recount for me things that many of them I saw firsthand about 6 months in, but listening to her go back and talk about what it was like to show up in Austin, she just did such an extraordinary job, I thought, of really describing what was stressful. So that first scene was one of the very first chapters I wrote for the book based on our friendship. I said, what happened that first day you showed up? And she talked about her shoes, how stressed she was about her shoes, how weird it was to try to go down the escalator, right? And how she didn't have the right kind of suitcases, how the smell of people and air conditioning and, she just felt assaulted by all of these smells. And it was such a great reminder to those of us who kind of casually journey on airplanes, what an absolutely overwhelming experience that was for someone who had hardly ever left her camp. And so that's part of what I wanted to show, was her own sense of discomfort and stress and overwhelmedness in moving into these spaces that for us, we kind of dismiss as like, oh, she's at an airport. Oh, she went to an apartment. Now she's getting food. Like, we can kind of take these as really easy steps, when for her, they were massive, monumental culture shocks.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you point out is that a lot of writing about refugees seems to imply they have no agency.
Yes.
And they are dependent, and yet you do show through both of these women's stories just the remarkable agency and energy they do in fact possess. And it's not necessarily a patron-client relationship at all, because people do have some autonomy and they do have agency, and that's often a missing part of these kinds of stories.
Yeah, part of what I am so glad you saw that. Part of what I am really concerned about in the way that we often portray and former refugees and other immigrants and others, is when we view them through a Western lens. And again, this is where I bring my academic work in here. One of my favorite books is just such a great shorthand, was White Women Writing White. And so I mean, literally, I studied Elizabeth Bishop and all the problematic ways she portrayed people. Like, when I say I go deep into this, it was very difficult for me at times not to get stuck in my awareness of all the things that I could do wrong, right? And so one of my solutions to that was to keep the focus on these women so deeply tight that there was a camera right over their shoulder at all times. Though there are some scenes where I was actually there and super wish that I had taken better notes than I did, because I had no idea I would write this book. I only reconstructed this through their memories. And so it took us 2 years of very in-depth interviews in order to have something that feels like what they viewed. I didn't want this to be a resettlement agency idea or a journalist's idea. I wanted this to be as close to a reconstruction of what they remember in their own words. And there were several things that both of them, Hasna and Muna, said, I'd actually like to take that out, or I'd really rather us not do it that way. So they had real ownership of how their stories were shaped. And it was my favorite thing about this is watching them realize some things. It was in some ways like I was painting a portrait that they were describing to me of themselves. And as they looked at it, I saw both of them say, I am stronger than I knew. Like, Muna it was like both of us cried the day that Muna realized she hates it when people tell her she can't do something. And when that happens, it shifts for her. And that a lot of the action in the story you'll see is when somebody says, you can't do this, or this isn't going to work. And she's like, oh, I'm going to show you. And she realized this was like a personality trait that she had, and that there was real strength in that. And so her goal in this book was for women to know that they're strong. And I just loved that. I loved getting to bring that in. This was her. She had agency over her own story. She is a person that has her own agency. The only reason she's not able to write her own story is because she has family members still in danger. So I wanted to be a conduit as much as I could for her story, for both of them. Yeah.
And I think too, in your afterward, you really, I mean, what's kind of good is we get inside of your head in terms of your recognition of intersectionality here, and you're working to listen to their voice. And so I just commend to our listeners, do buy the book, number one, but secondly, the afterward, I think, is just really quite compelling when you talk about your method, about style, and the choices you made or the choices you didn't make in terms of telling that story. And it was really, really quite compelling.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a big deal to me, just to make sure that people understand that this is not another white person imposing her ideas of what it means to be a refugee. This is someone with more than a decade of relationship in this community, doing my best to allow them to speak in their own voices while still hiding their identity. So one of the lines that I talk about is, I hide what needs to be hidden and tell what needs to be told. Because I think there is a place for these kinds of urgent stories for people who don't necessarily have the language or the desire. Neither of them want to be the person in the front. I have tried on a number of occasions to have some kind of radio option or something so that their voices can be heard with it, and neither of them are interested in that, but both of them deeply want their story told. And so figuring out how to do that, yeah.
No, it was just wonderful. Let's move to Hasna's story now, because
Yeah.
hers is quite different. It comes from a different part of the world, but if you just again sort of give us the capsule of her sojourn in Syria and out, and then also what it was like to come to Austin, Texas.
Yeah, again, one of the things that I was conscious of doing in this was wanting to work against the stereotype that many Americans have of the Middle East as a place where conflict just happens and who even knows. And again, and I know that most of the audience that's listening to this certainly does not see that, but it is something that happens, I think, quite a bit in our, even in the way that, even in the news publications that I have, often I have to work with editors. I'm like, we can't just reduce someone's story to like, and then there was a bomb, and then there was this thing. So what I wanted to do was show, she had a line, over a year into our conversations, in which she talked about the name Syria tastes like honey on her tongue. And if I could describe what I wanted to happen, especially in the early part of the book, it was that the home that she had, the very first conversation we had, she spent an hour telling me where her plants were laid out in her courtyard. And I thought, this is the person whose story I could tell. Muna was easy for me. She's still one of my best friends. That was not a hard decision for me. When it came time to telling someone else's story, I wanted to juxtapose someone. I wanted to make the argument in this book, you can't care more for a Christian refugee from Myanmar than you do a Muslim refugee from Syria, that we can't choose these people. And I wanted to show the very different experiences that people from Syria had arriving in comparison to what I had seen from so many people who arrived from Myanmar and other places. And so I was, as I was meeting people, listening to Hasna describe with just such love, but also just some strategy. I'm not sure how to describe it other than that. Like, she's so very good at explaining what was happening and how it changed. I really wanted to describe it. So the first third of the book really, we don't get to her crossing the border for a while, because I wanted us to, as readers, to sit in her home and understand the complexities as much as possible of what's at stake. There's so much that we cut that she told us. There's so many delightful stories I wish I could have included. This home just meant everything to her. And so one of the Syrian beta readers that I had read over that section before I sent it to my editor said, I wish I could stay in the very beginning of the book. And I feel that way. Like, for me, I took on some of her just grief. The country of Syria was a place where she never locked her doors, and she knew all of her neighbors, and she'd lived there for generations. This was not some place she was dying to leave so she could get to the United States. The war began in her hometown, and it was just with some neighbor kids, and everything shifted. And those of us, I think, who have been around protests and see how there's agitation in our cities have some connection with that, right? We don't know what's happening right now. And for Hasna and others, what's happening ended up being a war that took everything from them. And I wanted to show that.
In my travels, I've met a number of Syrian refugees, and have met Syrians, frankly, all across Europe too. And there is this level of grief, because they remember the deep pluralism and
Yes.
the intoleration is become kind of a watered down word in Western culture. But there was this pride that
Yes.
they found a way over centuries to live together and to prosper and to celebrate, and for all of that to be now lit up with a match, in particularly, I think, for people who have fled and have seen family members back home still suffering. There's just a palpable pain there.
Yes. Yeah. I think when I think of the country of Syria now, the first things that I think of are having, had coffee with just, again, dozens of Syrian people. It is a place where Christians were related to Muslims who were also close friends with Druze. Like they were able to live together in this beautiful place. They received refugees from Palestine and from Iraq. The hospitality of Syrians is next. I mean, you and I both have traveled in lots of places, and I know lots of people from around the world. I've never seen anything like this, almost to a fault. I showed up at a friend's house the other day, the translator, Amina, who worked with Hasna and I, to drop off a gift with her. And she had a latte waiting for me because I told her I didn't want to come in. Like, the idea that I would show up and not get coffee was
Right.
so stressful, right? And that was her workaround. For us to reduce this, and I'm sorry to use this, but it's the language that's being used by our president right now, to jihadist regions. This is not my grief. And yet those of us who are in positions where we do not have, like, I do not have relatives at stake in this, we need to be the first in the line speaking out against this kind of stuff, because it is horrible for this country to have endured what it's endured, and then for us to reduce their grief and shame to just to dismiss it in these ways. It really is a shameful part of where we are in this moment in our country's history.
I have a couple of friends who are American Foreign Service officers who served in Syria even as the conflict began to break out. And they carry with them, after having served like 3 years in Damascus, they in other places, they still feel a kind of cultural pain in their bodies because of they have absorbed some of the pride and some of the history of Syria. And it's really quite extraordinary to see when you know somebody who grew up in the United States but lived there for a number of years, that they too carry oftentimes sort of an echo or trace of that same sort of national and cultural pain that a lot of Syrians do carry with them. Wonder if you talk a little bit about, both with Muna and Hasna, the intersection of religion. Now, obviously in Myanmar, it's quite complicated, but also in Syria, it's quite complicated. And I'm wondering, when it all gets to Austin, Texas, what religious dynamics do you see going on between the agencies and their clients, but also the refugees themselves?
Yeah, I think, I actually don't think I've talked about this with anyone. The faith of these two women is the most important thing. And I don't think I'm giving anything in the book away to say I end the book with both of them praying. And that was an intentional choice.
Yeah.
Throughout both of their stories, their faith was something that came up on a number of occasions at every turn. And so Muna had a split household with a Baptist parent and a Buddhist parent and a Christian parent. And it reflected what often happens in Myanmar. So missionaries went over to Myanmar in the 1850s, and there were like different missionaries that targeted different regions in Myanmar. So you'll have predominantly Karen people, if they're Christian, tend to be Baptist. Karenni people tend to be Catholic. And so before the war in Myanmar, which has its roots in Western colonialism, right? So the way that the colonial powers divided up regions across with no regard for separate groups that were kind of stuck within one border and had not been before, it created this melting pot, or this kind of a crucible in which these tensions were going to be happening. So it's a simplification to say that Karen people are being targeted because of their faith, but in some ways their faith is part of that, because the junta is targeting people who are not ethnically Burman, or at least has historically, right? And so now the Rohingya refugees on the other side of the border are fleeing, and they tend to be Muslim, though again, these are complicated situations, right? And so what I really wanted to show in this was, again, kind of going back to that argument of the faith of Hasna and the faith of Muna. Muna came to Christianity through her husband late in life, and it is something that has become very powerful for her, but was not something she always believed in. And Hasna has just deep associations with the faith of her grandmother, who was a Muslim, and she has a family that's deeply faithful, and has, her prayers, I think, are just as important to her as Muna's. And so one of the things that I think we're often missing when we dismiss people based on their religion is what this looks like in their lives. And so again, I kind of wanted to juxtapose this, because in a way that I don't want to make this sympathetic, but I was often, you and I are both from places where I wanted to make sure that people who came to this book could see the loving and wonderful sides of a woman that it's just really easy to see. I feel like it's silly that we even have to make that argument. Not silly, actually offensive that we have to even make this argument. I'm very frustrated that we have to be in a place where we have to humanize people. And yet I wanted to show someone whose faith has been passed down for generations, just like my own family's, and has just as deep a sense of that as we do.
I think back to Hassan's daughter, I think Layla, I believe is her name, Leela. And she has a piety of her own. She has a devotion that in some ways exceeds the observance of the mother there. And the way you portray that, I think, is so powerful to knock down some Western stereotypes about Islam, for instance, and gender in Islam. So that was.
And also, I do just want to say, like, some of this wasn't just so that I could knock down misconceptions. I feel like the way I'm talking that's true, but also this was just the truth of what has happened. Hasna believes in it. Layla there was a resurgence of interest in really faithful, like wearing the hijab. Hasna had not always worn the hijab until her daughters did. And she loves the piety, and she loves that it came from her smart daughters who thought about these things and asked great questions and moved into those spaces and brought their mother along. It's really important to her that story kind of comes from the bottom up in some ways, generationally. And I think a lot of us have that experience of watching our kids be really smart and think things through, and we learn from them. And it was just really neat to kind of be able to witness that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that was just really incredibly well told. Let's move now. We've made some sort of signaling towards U.S. Policy, but one of the things you do, I think, really quite brilliantly, is I've read a lot of arid texts about U.S. refugee policy historically. There's actually an Oxford handbook. It's only like 800 pages long.
Oh my gosh.
On the UN Convention of 1951. So.
I probably have that somewhere. I'll be honest. It's probably in the stack.
Maybe like blocking a door open or something. But what you do, you skillfully, in between the episodes between the two women's powerful story, you do have these historical vignettes going back really to the beginning of the 20th century, and you take us all the way down to contemporary times about the zigs and zags and the retreats and the advances. And you sort of paint it as a dialectic between sort of the liberals and the restrictionists. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if, I know it's unfair to ask you to summarize like 8 chapters here, but sort of where are we, and maybe how did we get here? Maybe that's the way to pose the question.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the fact that it is readable, I often get that comment from people that like, this is a really readable history. And I think that is a true testament to my amazing editor who spent a great deal of time telling me, you absolutely cannot include that either. So if you look at my endnotes are a little outrageous.
No, they're great.
Thank you. You're the only person that cares. Academics love my notes. I had it for whatever reason. It gave me such peace of mind to be able to say, I'm leaving all of these things out. You should look at these 10 books that I consulted. Right.
Right.
It took the iron will of my amazing editor to keep this so close. And part of what I think we wanted to do was this is not a policy book. I wanted to show this is the history of the rhetoric of the way that we talk about refugees. This is the history of how the thing that I find so fascinating is that public opinion is the thing that changed refugee resettlement. It is not humanitarian crisis. And so I went into this thinking, I knew some of the basics of this. Again, I have a doctorate that studied poetry in the middle of the 1950s or so. So I knew a lot of the kind of rhetoric of the time. Mm-hmm. Refugees were always just outside the frame of what I was doing when I looked at poetry. But looking at this, I didn't realize how much had shifted and how the public opinion, it was not as if like there was kind of this cognizant, thoughtful response to humanitarian crisis. In fact, it was like, the US is in uproar, I guess we should do something. It's kind of like what the US American public thinks about things is the thing that has changed this policy, but this policy affects real people, right? And so the liberalizers and the restrictionists, this is a historical term that I found so fascinating because the positions have shifted. The restrictionists, the people wanting to close the doors, were historically Democrats because they did not want people coming over and taking jobs in the early part of the 20th century. And the liberalizers were often Republicans. And so these positions have been fairly similar, and the arguments being made about people are fairly similar, but the groups have changed, right? So the same arguments we're hearing about, like they're coming to take our jobs, they're all going to bring over disease, they are all really scary terrorists, or, coming, whatever the term is at the time. These are the same arguments that have been made for groups of people from China, from Ireland, from Italy, you name the place, like these people are coming to X, Y, and Z, do this to us. And it's the same sort of fear mongering. And so I wanted to show that this is not a new moment for us, right? This is exactly where we've been for a long time. And yet in some ways where we are and where we've been in the last 5 years, and this is not about one administration, this is about a larger public turn. This has changed so much. You have to go back to the 1920s, and there have been so many great books that have been written about this. You have to go back to the 1920s to find this kind of racist language, this kind of xenophobic isolationist policies being normalized on such a like large stage as we're getting right now.
And you use the term, I don't know if you coined it or not, but if you did, you should certainly claim it. You talk about political whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
and even in refugee policy. So it was Eurocentric, say,
Yes.
post-World War II. Can you say more about how that's still alive and well?
Absolutely. I cannot imagine that I coined that. I'm sure that is something that lots of people have been saying, but I feel like you can add whiteness to just about anything, and it covers a lot of what we've been doing as a country in the last couple, 4 centuries at least. So I think the political whiteness of this, one of the chapters that when I began just looking at this in terms of numbers, so I really didn't spend a lot of time, so many so many refugee books really focus on, that this many million people are displaced and this many, but I wanted to kind of use those numbers to give us a sense of the scope of that when we were going through history. And as I began looking at that, I realized there were so many places, what was happening in India in the 1940s, so again, post-colonial literature is kind of my jam. And so as I was looking through all of these places where there had been displacement, where there were major civil wars that caused humanitarian crises, there was zero US response until you get to about the 1970s. And so the history of who is allowed to come into the United States and what it means to be a refugee, for a long time, there was no separate term. And then that meant Jewish refugees. And then that meant anti-communist refugees. And in the 1970s, that meant people that were fleeing the Vietnam War. And so it was only as the 1965 Immigration and Nationalization Act opened up some of the conversations around the civil rights that you began to see that reflected in who was allowed to come to the US. And so I feel like we need to really reckon with the fact that it has not been that long that we have even welcomed people from other countries based solely on what is happening with their humanitarian issues, right? And there's so many complexities around that, but I think this is not something that we have done well or even have done in any sort of consistent way until about 1980. And we have about 40 years under us, really about 35 and then 5 bad ones, right?
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest too, now in the current administration, with the 3 attempts at getting the Muslim ban as strong as they could, it's very clear there that part of the problem is the color of the skin of the folk who might be coming from many of these countries. The same is true at our southern border now, with where we're turning people away who have a legal right to come and apply for asylum, but these are not white Christian folk in either example, either from Muslim majority countries or from the triangle in Central America coming up through Mexico. So I think you see a renaissance of this old
Yes.
kind of restrictionism here, and it is racially based, it is ethnically based, and it has deep roots in American history.
And I don't think that there's any surprise about this. So then on Friday night, while many of us were kind of reeling from the news of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, Trump was giving a campaign rally in which he was talking about refugees. And I've been pitching this story as much as I can this week. And this is part of my frustration. And I think a lot of us feel this way, is like whatever the news cycle is at the moment so dominates it that we're not able to talk about some of these very, very important things that are happening and are not receiving the kind of national attention that we're hoping for. And so the refugee resettlement, I mean, the way that he was talking about refugees, he just called them, they're going to come and overwhelm your schools. These people from jihadist regions, I mean, they're just truly offensive language that we're so used to hearing that we don't realize. There have been hundreds of examples of this from the president and from others. It is deeply offensive, and yet it kind of gets lower down in our list of things that we're outraged about. And I want to keep that at the forefront. We should not talk about people in racialized ways. It should not happen. And yet we are, and it's become normal. It's really concerning.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in that same speech, he told the folks of Minnesota they had good genes. And I mean, it can't be more overt than that.
Yeah.
So back in 2016, I did kind of a quick tour of 6 refugee resettlement centers, including one in Dallas. And one of the things I saw was a level of really grassroots interreligious collaboration.
Yeah.
I was in a refugee resettlement center in New Jersey. And before I went in to meet with a group of refugees, I went with the director into his office. And it sounds like a bad joke, but literally an evangelical pastor, an imam, and a rabbi were sitting in his office.
Mhm.
And they had congregations within 20 minutes of one another. They had never acknowledged the other's existence, except when they walked into this refugee resettlement center and realized that at the heart of their particular theological beliefs in their different communities was this love and compassion for the displaced, the refugee, the person in need. And so I began to see a kind of a new form of interreligious collaboration springing up at the grassroots.
Yeah.
I finally convinced an NPR reporter there was a story there, and Deb Amos actually did a remarkable story. But I'm like you, it's hard to pitch that story in the contemporary media environment.
What you're describing is no surprise to me or anyone else who has worked with refugees. The only surprise to me is that they didn't acknowledge each other's existence. I found this so fascinating in Texas. I still feel, though, I mean, I was talking to someone and someone who worked at a resettlement agency the other day. We still feel sucker punched about this, because when I think of refugee resettlement, I think of I was attending a church and we joined with several other groups and renting an apartment within the apartment complex that people had, and we called it the Village Center because the apartment complex was called Villages at Lamar, and it was this shared space for people of every group and religion, and there was no sense. Okay, there were some people that were like, we should probably proselytize them. So we had an entire meeting in which we had this conversation about like why we are absolutely not going to do that, right? Like the goal was never to bring people over and kind of secretly indoctrinate them. The goal was to meet people where they were and to just befriend them. And you saw this with a handful of exceptions all across the country, right? Like people joined together on every side to rally around this. And I think that's what has made this time so deeply hurtful to me, to be totally honest. I have very conservative relatives who I know for a fact would be the very first people that would take Hasna's family into their home. Their hospitality is unquestioned to me. And yet, and I have seen what it has looked like in their communities when they have rallied around former refugees and how they have just done beautiful jobs of creating these kind of hybrid places. And yet we're at the point where they're saying, I don't want Hasna's children to come over. I am uninterested in the danger that Hasna's grandchildren are currently living in today. And I just don't think we can I don't think we can dismiss the fact that we've made this sharp shift. It's been a very short amount of time that we've been talking about refugees in this way. And I hope that there's a chance we can return. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's true. There are 9 refugee resettlement partners with the State Department, and 6 of those 9 agencies are faith-based. Almost all of them have had massive layoffs of staff. So a lot of these refugee resettlement centers now basically are just fractions or shadows of what they once were. Well, let's move to that question. I mean, if you were in charge of the world,
I would have a long list, yeah.
But what we have resettled, back in the Reagan era, 200,000 refugees a year for several years. What would the best system look like in terms of the United States refugee resettlement system if suddenly you could snap your fingers and make it so? What would be different? What would it look like today?
Well, okay, so I'm going to begin with the caveat that I have a doctorate in poetry and I'm not a policy person. And so what I am good at is listening. And this is what I have heard from several different people and what I find compelling. There is something called the GRACE Act that was introduced into Congress last year that would set a minimum floor as well as having a ceiling. Right now, the way that the Refugee Act, I had an amazing conversation with Representative Elizabeth Holtzman last week, who brought the Refugee Act through the House in 1980. It passed the Senate unanimously. And I asked her, do you have regrets about the fact that you have given so much control to the president? And she said, we just never thought anyone would turn against refugees in this way. And so it was not a question. There was such profound bipartisan national support for resettling refugees at the time. And this was after the Vietnam War. So this was not a non-polarized time in US history, right? And so I think there's some significant changes that have to be made immediately. One of those is we need to not ever allow any one branch of government to have such control that they can decimate the system. This is a system that took decades to build up, and the damage that's been done is pretty profound. At the same time, there is some opportunity. Anytime anything is destroyed, there is opportunity to rebuild and to rebuild better. And so I was lucky to get to hear the Biden campaign. Tony Blinken was giving a presentation about their plans, and I think there are some really amazing things that they're doing. One of the things that I liked, and they didn't talk about this, is they featured the voices of former refugees in this conversation. Many of the policy people have relatives who are former refugees. Many of the people leading the charge are former refugees, and I think that's something that has to be really important. I think that if we are to rebuild, there's some really beautiful ways to do resettlement outside of the United States. Canada's doing some interesting things, and some other countries are doing things where there is community support and communities are able to sponsor people. And so I think keeping it just in this kind of 9 resettlement agencies, there may be some opportunities to expand what we mean when we think of resettlement. Mostly, I think we just need to never be able to have any president or anyone else ever again be able to take us to this low place, especially at a time when there's such a great need. I don't think resettlement is the only answer. I think resettlement is a tiny, 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 tiny piece of a much larger system internationally that needs to be, that has major things that need to be addressed. And there are very smart people that are doing this. The focus of my book was resettlement. So I think we don't want to act as if resettlement is the only way for refugees to receive the kind of help that they need. But if we were to fix resettlement, I think keeping a floor, having a higher ceiling, and ensuring that agencies and others that are partnering with them are not going to have this kind of really complicated up and down. That was what was happening in the 1950s and 60s. That's part of why they started the Refugee Act in 1980, so that the ad hoc policies would be stabilized into this program. So we need to find a way to stabilize it more thoughtfully.
Yeah, that's really great. Let me remind everybody listening, please send in your questions right now. We're going to move to that in a couple more minutes. So we've got a couple in the queue, but please send some more in. I wonder too, one of the most powerful statements is early. In fact, I think it's in your introduction that you come to see this issue as a bellwether for the compassion and really the moral compass of our country. And yet you sort of, the compass, obviously, you're saying it's moved back and forth. What role do communities of faith in the United States play here in terms of being engines for generating that kind of compassion? Just if you could say a little bit more about that.
You know, I think that what is so, I did not in any way set out to write a love letter to a federal program. And I feel like that's a bit what I did, right? As I was watching this kind of collapse in real time and writing this book in the years in which this was happening. This is not some historical book that I wrote about what happened in the past, right? There was a measure of just real kind of grief that I feel around that. And in part, it's because there are so few, we are very adamant about the separation of church and state, as we should be in this country. And yet there are so few places where people from a variety of faiths all come together for the greater good, in partnering with government officials and government programs in order to create this. I mean, it's really a supply chain or a pipeline in which people are able to come and have hope. I mean, it is just, now that I look back on it, I almost can't believe it was able to come together. It feels like such an unlikely thing, right? And I think I probably used that word a few times in the book too. And yet it was remarkable looking back on what had been, and the ways that I think this is a core tenet of all religions, right? And to care for people, not just because they're going to give something to you, not a transactional caring for them, but a relational caring, right? I care for you because I can be in relationship with you, or even kind of just on the broader, it's better for these people, even if I'm not connected with them, even if I don't know them. So often we get stuck in well, I know a refugee and now I care about them. And we should be able to think more compassionately and on a broader scale than that, right? I know that people are being killed. We have this amazing land that we have taken over and have, we have our own complicated history, right? But there's room. And so we should do the bare minimum that we can in order to help people, and in conjunction with lots of other things in which we are keeping our allied partners from not, being overwhelmed by this. But I think it's really, for me, I think the real step forward is going to have to come from people of a variety of faiths, because they understand the kind of necessary leap that we need to make in order to do things for the common good.
I think that's right. And I think most of the major religions and even some not so major religions, the leadership, have really been quite eloquent and powerful. Oftentimes, as you know as well as I do, leadership can be clear and there can be prophetic voices, but in terms of the rank and file,
Yeah.
sometimes the gap is really quite large. And I think a lot of, and speaking just in terms of Christian communities, sometimes the Christian community leadership has not been effective at actually convincing the constituency that indeed this is an issue where our compassion should grow legs and should actually manifest itself. All right, we've got a couple of questions here. Let me see. Oh, here's a great question from Jessica Miller. She asks, what careers would you recommend for people who want to do more and work with refugees? Now, you're answering this as a literature scholar, so that's just perfect. That's great.
Let's be super clear that my career path is one I hope no one follows, because it is a very odd one. For people who want to work with refugees, is that kind of the end goal?
Yeah. How do you get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a number of nonprofits that are doing this. And so you can do it in America, in the United States, through working with resettlement agencies. You can do it more broadly by working with UNHCR and others. I'm having a fantastic series of conversations with a former refugee named Ahmed Bader, who has it's a group called narradio.org, and it's like narration with no N. And listening to him talk about the spectrum of NGOs around the world that are, they have artists, they have, they have lots of people doing like very specific NGO kind of nonprofit work. I mean, there are just so many spectrums there are just so many ways in which groups from a variety of positions are able to work with refugees. And so I would say, to me, it's more, you can do it as a journalist, you can do it as a writer, you can do it in a variety, you can do it as a doctor. There are so many ways in which you get to do this. And I think that's part of what is so unique about this particular moment. And it's not just refugees, it's displaced people. We're at a place in our world where we have people who are displaced for a variety of reasons, not just because of war or persecution. And the UN's very rigid and very small definition often means that people who qualify as refugees get attention. I mean, this happened in my book, and it's something I always also want to call attention to. There are just millions of people right outside of this definition who are also not receiving that kind of attention. So law, I mean, I feel like you could just name almost anything, and like it's possible in almost any way from almost any discipline to kind of come in and focus on humanitarian issues and what's happening with displaced people around the world. And boy, do we need that right now. I think this is going to be the issue of this century. And if we don't realize that, then we're really missing out. I think we're seeing in our own country right now with what's happening in Portland and California, and with the hurricanes that are coming through alone. People are going to be displaced by climate change and by war and by persecution. And we're going to have to figure out how to address that in a variety of ways. So yeah, almost anything is my answer.
Yeah, well, no, your point's well taken. There's some scholars now arguing that the wider term "people on the move" dwarfs refugees, and there are other people arguing that people who move because of climate change may become very quickly the largest single source.
Yes.
And they don't fit the legal framework as you observe. I would also say, in going to these 6 centers, just talking to the staffs, and I remember I was in Dallas at a center run by Catholic Charities, and I asked, there was a constellation of 4 just brilliant young women, and I said, how did you get here? Tell me your stories. And all of their paths, many of them started out by doing internships in resettlement centers, but their academic training was just radically different from each other. So I completely agree. There are many paths to this work. Here's another question. This is from Andrea Bischoff. I've been to several interfaith dialogue conferences with the Vatican and Hindu/Buddhist religious coming together. How can our education system encourage future generations to develop religious literacy and understanding? A great question. What do you think about that?
Shaun, take a stab at it first. You're someone who does religious training. I have some thoughts on that, but I'd be curious what you think first.
Well, I mean, I had to hire and build a staff of 35 in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. And my second question to myself was, where am I going to find the people who are qualified to do, who have a security clearance? So it was a pretty a small set. But I think there's a lot of religious literacy work going on now in universities, where as our universities become more diverse religiously and ethnically, as the country does, some universities are responding very creatively in seeing that as a resource in the student body, and then actually trying to create spaces in curricula that helps encourage these kinds of conversations. But I think doing the work of helping refugees move into this bizarre culture through resettlement centers is itself a form. Some of the smartest people I know from interreligious perspective are folks who are former refugees who are now working in refugee resettlement agencies, because they have to develop this facility across an astonishing array of religious origins.
I think that's such a good answer. And I'm going to put on my Mellon. So when I'm a Mellon writing fellow and then working in the writing center at the small university, part of what we were looking at is how disciplines write and what it means for them to write and how to create interdisciplinary writing. And I think there's the same kind of opportunity. And again, this is something that you're really familiar with at a center that kind of crosses several disciplines. I think anytime we are so focused on the disciplinary boundaries of history or English or religion, that we don't recognize, and I think this happens a lot in academia. To be totally honest, think there is often as much fundamentalism in academia as there can be in religion. And I think and I actually know a lot of wonderful academics who are working against that. And I think the opportunities for people to recognize the points of connection. I think intersectionality is such a great word. And I've noticed how in the last 10 years, that's become such just a regular word that we use in our vernacular. And I think that kind of work is actually really important, because we don't expect people who are all of one religion to speak for everyone in that religion, but can recognize that there is a large spectrum of experiences. And so I just think there's the phrase that my best friend who started the nonprofit with me often talks about, the phrase structured flexibility. And I feel like that may be the move that we need in these ways, is how to continue to recognize the disciplinary structure that we need, but also be flexible within that as different groups come up or as learning takes us in all of these different ways. And I think that's the way that we're going to be able to teach these things more thoughtfully. I think it's possible in some ways in a college setting in a way that it may not always be in a younger grade setting. In part, that's because we're so focused on teaching to the test. And so I have some grief around that. As a parent, I feel like I'm constantly trying to navigate this with my own children and see other parents doing that too. I think that's more complicated when we get to high school and middle school and other grades, for sure.
No, we certainly saw that. My kids grew up here in Fairfax County, which in our 20 years has gone from really very white bread to now incredibly complex. And I used to listen to my kids, and one time I sort of rashly said, in the classroom, they're getting very little religious literacy or interreligious conversation, but in the cafeteria and on the soccer pitch, they're living it. But it's like the lack of structure there is part of its genius too. But it's strictly student driven, and it's outside of the classroom. One of the things we're trying to do at the Berkley Center, we have a brilliant staffer, Ryan Craig, who's listening. If she's listening, she's turning purple right now, but I'll brag on her. And we're trying to think about what are our learning outcomes? What do we want our students who come through our programs to learn? And are they learning what we think we're teaching? And oh, by the way, is what we're teaching what we should be? And these are just kind of basic fundamental questions that we want to align all of our student programming and our teaching so that we can actually say, actually, we may have 5 years of religious literacy training. We just didn't know it, or let's be more intentional. So I think this is, in terms of pedagogy, just an amazing opportunity here. Now, whether we'll be able to sort of scale it and scaffold it in a way that is productive remains to be seen. But I think your emphasis on writing may also be just this brilliant avenue that has been sitting in front of us, and we just haven't.
I'll just be honest, and I know we're probably moving to another question. I could probably talk about this. As someone who teaches writing, I think the critical thinking skills that we teach when we teach writing when we are missing those critical thinking skills in which people are able to listen to or read a text and understand the culture, like the culture in which someone's coming from and their religious background, I think really, and I think this is kind of what most people who are interested in pedagogy boil their, maybe not math, maybe this is not, maybe some of this is subject specific, but I think this is maybe the point of connection for a lot of at least the humanities is coming up against, like, we want to teach the kind of critical thinking skills that people can apply to a variety of subjects, including religion, in order to recognize where people are coming from or what their cultural constraints and abilities are. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think too, you talked about fundamentalism. Religion is often a third rail in a classroom, even in a humanities classroom.
Yes.
How do we model not making it a third rail, but actually making it a resource for acquiring these kinds of skills you're talking about? All right, let's see. We got another question here, and we still got a few minutes left. Let's see. Let me make sure I'm understanding this. Yeah, so somebody's referring that they saw the story on Yahoo News about the president talking about good genes among the Minnesotans in their blood, to the cheers of his audience.
Yeah.
And the question then is, how much racism is there in today's policy toward Muslims?
A lot. And I think this is part of what, so I come to this writing very concerned about how I, as a white woman, should not be appropriating stories.
Right.
And yet in tension with that, I, as someone who comes from a position of traditional power, as a Christian white woman from Texas, I mean, there are some things that I can say and do and absolutely should when it comes to speaking out against this kind of racism. We have not seen this again, looking at the history of this, we have not seen this kind of blatant language from a president or presidential candidate since the 1920s, when we had the Quota Act in 1924, in which they were basically only allowing people to come because they only wanted white Europeans, and they were very clear about it. It comes from kind of this eugenicist idea that white people were like scientifically superior to others. And so I feel deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about this. This is not just for this president. This has been happening for 20 years at least, if not longer. We've had several policies that have been highly anti-Muslim, and they have led to difficulties for not just, I'm sure that there are so many people in our audience that can tell so much better than I could what this experience has been like. And I think it really requires all of us who have relationships with people who are voting for someone using this kind of racist language. It requires all of us to put those relationships on the line. I'm having a complicated conversation right now with a relative who's pretty upset with me and talking about the kind of hatred that I have. And the truth is, I don't have hatred unless it's hatred for this kind of language. And I think we should. I think that is my moral duty. I think we should always call out language that talks about people's good genes and assumes that some group of people is there to overrun or overwhelm, or, and I mean, the list of things that have been said, it just goes on and on, right? And I think it's on those of us to do what we can to talk about it. Absolutely.
Oh, I think that's completely right. And I think one of the interesting things that has changed in my lifetime, I remember my first trip to Houston, Texas in 1975, where there seems to be there were more pickups than human beings.
Totally true.
In 2016, I went to Houston and spoke at Rice University. And it was not my freshman year in college, Houston, Texas. I mean, that may be the most religiously diverse city in the United States now.
I think that's probably true. Yeah, that seems right.
And that's where I draw hope for places like Texas, where I was, literally half a century ago. That even there, the complexity, the complexion, the diversity of Texas has undergone dramatic change. And so these issues, people are going to have to confront identity in new ways and realize that this old restrictionist view is not going to be successful going forward. It just by virtue of dealing with their neighbor, they're going to be folk are going to be forced to reckon in a new way with these realities.
Yeah, I would think, and yet at the same time, I think that I have talked to so many people who have said in the last 30 years, we've never had this kind of language. Like we've gone back so far so quickly.
Right.
So in the book, I talk, like I had, I turned on manuscript and long before this pandemic, but I talk about the kind of profound public awakening that it took after World War II to really drastically shift the anti-Semitic language around refugees. And I think that now is a moment in which we're going to have the same kind of profound public awakening. I hope that the pandemic, I would imagine that there is some element of that, and recognizing that we're all in this together, and that we're all, going through the same things, and that we all share the same basic humanity. I hope that those are the kinds of things that can rally us as a country to really speak out against this kind of stuff. I don't know that it will happen though. Some days I feel hopeful and other days I don't.
Yeah. Well, I think a friend of mine once said that when you attack racism, racism fights back. And I think that's what you're seeing, what we're seeing everywhere. But I do remain hopeful. And well, we've come to the end of our hour. Jessica Goudeau, thank you. The book is After the Last Border, Two Families and the Story of Refuge in America. It's a great read. Everybody, I'm going to be using this as a text next semester in a course. Thank you so much for your work, and wish you best of luck in promoting the book.
Thank you so much, Shaun. This has just been a really lovely conversation. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll have you back.
All right. It would be great. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.